What's going on, guys? Welcome to In the Zone. I'm your host, Garrison Roy, and today we're going to go into a deep dive, little exploration episode today. And if you're new to the episode, we do have mental minutes, which are quick mental game hacks. We also have full-length interviews, and then we also have rants where I just kind of go on and vent. But today it's going to be that deep dive where this one, usually in the past, we do the ones that have maybe scientific studies or things like that that have a little bit more tangible um, results or conclusions that we would usually come to. But this one, and I'll put it right here in the show notes, is more of a review of a podcast that I frequently go back to, and then someone who has influenced me ever since I first started coaching and going into the training and strength and conditioning realm of things. Was just Ido Portal. He was on the Huberman Labs podcast back in 2002. And what turned him on to me first, and I'll upload this one here too. I definitely think it's a must watch for a lot of guys who are in this industry, or even maybe you're not doing strength and conditioning in general, but it does help you get a better idea of overall human movement altogether. And Ito, he's has an extensive background in several other, mixed martial arts, um, you know, all the different types of skateboarding, I think was some of them that he's been in, but he's just really kind of uh, delved into so many different other disciplines that you could say he's a little bit more of a movement generalist than a uh, specialist or someone who specializes in one particular sport. Trained Conor McGregor and a bunch of other really well-known guys, and you can see the McGregor walk. You know, you probably visualize that in your head. And funny story, one of my athletes previously, Chris Abasachea, who's now a analyst for the Padres, but he had a very viral video go off on him having that nice little McGregor walk after he strutted off the field after striking out the side. So, um, but anyways, side note on that, this does kind of boil down into really what I talk about a little bit on what it means to, get out of the matrix or get out of this very prescribed or very templated way of thinking, right? And a lot of people are very familiar with spinal hygiene from Dr. Tommy John, who is Tommy John's son, believe it or not, the guy who the surgery was made after. Um, but they don't typically go down this rabbit hole of Ido Portal's spinal waves, right? So to give you a little bit of refresher, a spinal hygiene routine is just kind of general movements and all the different planes or ranges of motion. But a spinal wave is how well all those segments move together, right? So whether it's pitching or hitting, really just any type of athletic movement, you have a sequence of how things are moving through a kinetic chain, right? So as these things are moving and coming across and spiraling out, this is how you would really want to see things move, or even in nature. And what Ito really relates to is, different animals or different species on how they walk. And he has a different uh, locomotion routine, if you want to call it that, where he does things like horse walks, ostriches walks, or lizard crawls, bear crawls, right? A lot of people just know of mostly the bear crawls or crab walks, but there's so many other different variations that him just observing nature, he's trying to mimic that in their own human movement, right? And him and Huberman go down this a little bit of a tangent where they're talking about, different species, and if they're able to sing like birds and things like that, they're also able to move and they're also able to dance. So it gets really, really in depth, honestly. It's not too specialized, and you have to really zoom out your lens here to be able to kind of really get an idea of what they're trying to break down. Um, but this idea that Ito has, right, is having a little bit more of a challenge or adding some more playfulness, especially to higher level athletes. So, and they were using the spinal wave, like I was mentioning before, as a and as an example, right? So you could have some athletes who are really elite level hitters or boxers, or name any sport, But if you try to get them to segment kind of almost like a snake, right, doing a wave with their spine. So I'll show you in this video. If you're watching or if you're listening, imagine like how the snake would move forward. So I'm going with my nose, my chin, my chest, all the way down to my belly button and then my hips. And then I wave it back through nose, chin, right? And I have a very fluid range of motion. So same thing with whenever you're going through a throw or any dynamic effort. If you had fluidity or flow, right? And I kind of allude to Dr. Gallo's flows here a little bit. So there's some things here where you can kind of move in and out and transition out of things. So this is a little bit more of a global pattern system that we're addressing here, not necessarily just specifying of how to refine one specific skill only. But that's something that, especially in younger athletes, when they're first starting to come through all these developmental stages, that they're lacking a lot. They don't know how to get up off the ground. They don't know how to really just move in general. So how can we as coaches, especially those who might be specializing in other different sports, expect them to move really well if in general they can't move very well, right? And obviously they can walk or they can do all these things. And I really don't prescribe too much to the walking, gait cycle type of things, because that's also something that's very programmed into your head, where people can still walk regardless of however they have these issues. But it could, because they can't transition out of movements, because that repetitive motion of how they've been walking has been ingrained so much that they don't have to think about it very well. So again, these things are, just a little bit more of some of my notes that I'm getting off here. And again, going on a tangent, but it's also a very deep dive into general movement, right? And he gets into even more in depth with this. I highly encourage you guys to listen to this, but this is just kind of my spark notes for you guys to kind of get a little bit of a taste of this. It's more of how he is saying how current, how do I say this without offending too many people? Current strength and conditioning, or current just general population training, is very, very reductionist. And what I mean by that is they're just doing certain movements. They're removing the emotional state or the mental heightness or awareness to certain things. And we dove into this a little bit with the ecological dynamics podcast with Tanner Pruitt. But just unpacking this a little bit more, right? This is how you want to have your guys involved. If you're constantly getting your guy onto your guys about them going through the motions or not really, being present, or, they're skipping certain things through their lifts or skipping certain things through their warm-up, it's because it's not engaging and it's not playful. And I use the word playful in a way where it's like, hey, you can gamify literally all of your warm-ups, right? So for example, it'd be like, hey, show me how you can roll a bunch of different ways. And you have them do that. Or, hey, show me how you can do a handstand. That one's entertaining enough for some kids, or even certain athletes to be like, hey, can you even do a handstand? I don't know. And you kind of see a lot of fears, or guys who kind of get into their own head and be like, oh, I can't do that. Well, okay. Why? You definitely can. You're an athlete, right? But there's just certain things that guys, they get afraid whenever they start to do a skill or something that they're not used to doing, right? So, it's a lot of these, when you have all of this compact together, you have to look at the full picture, right? You have to look and see through some of these motions and some of these movements. And Ito talks about this on the podcast too, where certain people get emotional releases whenever they move with their spine in a way that they've never moved before, right? Like imagine a heavy power lifter doing just, heavy squats, deadlifts, bench press, and not saying that those are inherently bad. I still do them, but I also pair that with a movement such as a spinal hygiene or a wave, or maybe just something like a sprint, or, I'm running to go chase after a med ball, or one of my favorite ones from Yoakum Strength, he has certain plates set up where you can kind of just weave around and you're being athletic and you're moving or jumping, right? Being an athlete, being a human being that does certain things outside of those four barbell movements, right? Squat, bench, deadlift. cleans, whatever it is that you want to put in there. But um, not to get too much into a tangent, he also goes into a little bit of the squat being more of a passive range of motion. And he talks about like Scandinavians, how squats weren't really good for their environment, right? Like Scandinavian, very cold environments, if they squatted too much or they were sitting down, they couldn't really survive, right? So those type of people tend to have a very shallow hip socket in their lineage of how they've evolved due to their environment that they were in, right? Or someone who needed to squat, like let's say someone who, you know, maybe needed to cool off or couldn't have to have that folding resting position of a deep squat, right? They're going to have very deep hip sockets. And for me, I can hang out in a deep squat all day. So, and I've had x-rays of that, and I think I have a relatively deeper hip socket. And that also got me thinking into my tangent of how femoral heads and hip socket joints can affect things. And that also stemmed from my business partner, Rob's theory on internal versus external hip driver or movements. But again, if you want to really dive deep down into the anthropometry, like feel free to be my guest. I think that is very, very interesting and very I wouldn't say untouched, but very undiscovered for certain people. And knowing some of their guys' lineage and backgrounds can help them also understand how they could move better, but also, even unpacking that even more. So you go from their lineage to what they did in training throughout their, playing career to then now what they're currently doing. And is that helping or hurting their performance? Right? Like that's all a lot of things to look into. But Ito basically essentially says, hey, like if you don't fold, right, if you don't squat, you don't rest, or you don't move in certain positions, you're gonna lose that, right? It's a use it or lose it kind of thing where you're losing a foldability or you're losing, certain things that you're able to actually do. And you want to continue to challenge yourself, to have different movements, to have different, challenges, if you will, right? And I always like to give guys some type of a challenge throughout practice or throughout training sessions to see how they solve those problems, right? And again, kind of referring back to what I was talking to before, where if you see a guy who's never done a handstand before, they get very blocked in their head where they're like, oh, what do you mean? I don't know how to do that. So you have to maybe reduce it down a little bit, maybe not a free handstand. You put a wall around them and give them a little bit of a safety net. And then from there, you progress for it to be a freestyle handstand where there's nothing else around them and they can graduate to that. But again, it's more than just, isolating or doing certain movements and thinking that that's just going to be the end all be all, right? Because there's chemistry and brain thought processes and neurology that's involved with this so that you have to interact with the athlete and know what's going on, right? Huberman goes down a whole nother thing where he's talking about how motor neurons and premotor neurons, how they have the patterns that are pre-downloaded. So I talked about this already with walking. The neocortex, those are already conceived in a way unless you have to afford and move around and change how you walk versus like just being on a treadmill, right? So a very mindless movement, and that's pretty much programmed in unless you're consciously thinking about changing how you're walking, versus anticipating or being ready to move based on the environment around you. I think that's a lot more effective for an athlete or for someone who needs to move efficiently. And again, I think how Ito starts out this whole podcast where he even talks about how, okay, there's movements, like lowercase movements, where there's different types of things that you can choose from, right? Whether it's like yoga movements, powerlifting movements, training movements, what have you. You could list pretty much all the types of means into that. But he really kind of brings this into more of a philosophy of, hey, we are movers, right? And we move, and there's a bunch of other layers that he unpacks more deeper into philosophy, which I won't really get into, right? But Um, he says like, hey, like there's a way or an evolution of how like, fish or animals, how they undulate. Like I talked about the spinal wave movements where they're coming through and they're moving through their spine. And that central orientation um, starts to go away if you don't move from that, right? So like if you never think about having a spinal engine, so to speak, right? And he references this a little bit, but it goes a lot deeper where it starts in your mindset. It starts with where you start and thinking about how you're going to solve certain issues. Is this just a list of exercises that you're going to do and try to perform perfectly to a T? Or are you trying to challenge yourself, right? And that's also kind of the thing where I'm trying to get at with this red pill versus blue pill, being in the matrix or not, right? Or and putting it in a little bit more of baseball perspective, because I know a lot of you listeners are into baseball. The expression "throw like a girl," right? You see someone who may not really have a great throwing pattern because they don't do it very often. It's just really just less experience of doing that one particular thing, right? But you never see someone who has a lot of experience look like they throw like a girl necessarily, right? So over time, they tend to uh, get a little bit better at these movements. And it really kind of boils down to, and I love this analogy of what they use, where it's like, hey, what's ultimate here, right? Should you live this way where you're constantly doing different things, or do you have a set rigid way of how you're going to do some of your movements? And again, I kind of prescribe to a little bit of the truth is in the middle, um, where Ito talks about, hey, like if a tree is being built, right, there's obviously a seed, something very natural when it's into the ground. It's from a seed growing into a tree. That's a very natural occurrence, things that are just kind of happening more ecologically, right? Versus a tree getting chopped up into a chair, right? So a lot more methodical, a lot more um, different methods, not necessarily natural, but it still does uh, serve a purpose, right? Or he uses this as a wild versus the wise terminology of how he tries to bring this together. And again, I think you need both. Obviously, in the world, both exist, right? But if one gets a little too out of whack, if you're too rigid, you're too set on how things need to be set or how things need to move, that's probably going to stagnate a little bit. And he talks about water a little bit here as well, versus the trees, right? It's very natural. You have to deal with elements, you have to deal with a lot of other things that are going around. Obviously, the seed has to catch into good soil. So if you're not surrounded by good soil, right, I can think about a biblical parable to go on with this too, right? But um, it's a constant tug of war, I think, as a coach, where you want things to emerge organically, but also certain things you have to kind of instruct. And that's the art of coaching, really. But this, again, I'd highly encourage you guys to go back and listen to this podcast that I have in the show notes here for you guys to really unpack this and maybe even shift your perspective on certain things on how you go about training or even just looking at movement in general. Because it's something that uh, a lot of people just kind of need to discover and discover their own movements of how they would go and solve certain problems versus it being scripted out for them to do all the time. Um, and I love this is kind of a closing thought here where he said, don't demonize things, but don't over glorify them. And I think that was very well said, right? Like certain things can be demonized where you're saying, hey, this is wrong for everyone, right? And kind of my perspective on pivot picks. Is it wrong for everyone? Probably not. It can probably help some guys, but do we over glorify it and think that it's something that everyone needs to do? Yeah, I think that's also being done as well. So that's just certain things that I am unpacking throughout my brain and my philosophy of not only training through baseball, but training through life, right? Me personally, I'm trying to, like I mentioned before, add a little bit more athletic movements versus just kind of being stiff and rigid or being stuck on a treadmill all the time. Like Ito says, he tries to walk around and dodge people and, in big, really big crowds. And that causes him to have different movements, right? And I think that's really, really awesome to have that kind of perspective and approach. And he's not a big fan of um, technology or wearable stuff, things like that. Again, I think there's room for it, but if you lean on it too much, you don't know how to adapt as a coach. You don't know how to shift and pivot based on what's happening um, in front of you or what you have available, right? And honestly, a really good exercise to do as a coach is to maybe step out of your comfort zone a little bit. If you have too much tech, maybe have a few days where you go take your guys out and you don't have any around and see how you uh, allow your guys to cope or what you kind of gravitate towards, or even vice versa. If you're a coach who's a little bit more old school, may not have a whole lot of tech, don't try to just be all into your feel. Maybe lean a little bit or try to learn a little bit more of that, right? And there's all things that we can certainly grow in and have that. And if you guys are looking for anyone to help you out as far as a coaching perspective, I do have that coaching mentorship that you can reach out to me on. Just email me at royalperformance@gmail.com or any of the socials that you guys see this on, or in the zone podcast 123@gmail.com. But I appreciate you guys always listening in, hearing my perspective. I know I ramble a lot on my own. I try to bring in as many other thought processes and different ways of thoughts to challenge you guys, um, not only as players or coaches, but also as humans. So appreciate you tuning in. If you get anything out of this, please share it and stay in the zone.